to reduce consumption of those products. And also from a study that we did with Oxford University and TNC, we know because methane, if you look at the short-term nature of methane in the atmosphere, if you reduce methane in the short term, you have a higher impact. So because of that, what's called GWP star factor, we can actually have a huge impact by reducing a small amount of methane. So those are tips about how we can achieve net zero. So with my colleague Siniro Costa Jr., we examined 64 different scenarios for trying to achieve net zero in the food system. And it says a little bit about what can be done with the livestock sector as well. Here you can see this dotted line shows the 20 or so billion tons of CO2 equivalents that we need to reduce to zero by 2050. And on the bottom, you can see the series of scenarios. In the green, you can see what I would call the greenhouse gas efficient practices for all sectors. So for the livestock sector, these would be the practices that are that don't include deforestation, that have improved feed, that have energy efficiency, and it includes other sectors as well. But you can see that this green line only gets us so far, a little bit more than half. And so the question is, what more do we need to be able to achieve net zero? The orange line shows you carbon sequestration. So for the livestock sector, that would be pasture soil carbon, for example, or silvopastoralism, agroforestry. And you can then see across all of these different scenarios, we only have 8 scenarios by which a combination of greenhouse gas efficiency and soil carbon can achieve that net zero. So what more do we need? We added dietary shift, so we reduced the amount of livestock and substituted this with either vegetarian diets or alternative meat products. And we found that there are another 8 scenarios that can achieve net zero. But that's not enough. 48 of the scenarios include some technology. We don't know yet necessarily which technologies will fill that gap, but there's a need for new technologies to be able to help us reach the gap. So our conclusion is, if we want to be realistic, it's not going to be those 8 scenarios with just soil carbon and greenhouse gas efficiency. It's going to be probably among these different 48 scenarios what we ultimately are going to have to do. So it's going to be a combination of low emissions practices, carbon sequestration, diet shifts, and new technologies. I want to drill down into one of the technologies that has been somewhat promising, but there's been a lot of buzz and not enough evidence circulated around it, which is feed additives. So feed additives is one of the technologies that can reduce absolute emissions in the livestock sector. And together with the GRA, we did a review last year. And what we found was among the 10 different types of methane reducing feed additives, that only 3 had robust evidence. And these were 3-NOP, or what is known commercially as Bovaer, nitrates, and one other that I'm forgetting right now, that I'm blanking on, that'll come back to me. And so because of this limited number of additives, and especially because they are not applicable, broadly speaking, in grazing areas, they're only applicable to about 2% of the systems that are out there, because they require what's called total mean ration feeding systems. These are not widely available. We also have little evidence of the productivity gains from these, so there's no incentive for people to adopt them. At the most, we have about a 10% feed or productivity benefit. So this is the global picture, but we have to ultimately implement these in specific places. This is a summary we did last month of the NDCs and the action on livestock in the NDCs. And what we find is in the first round of NDCs, we had 60 countries. In the second round of updated NDCs, we only have about 45 countries who've updated their NDCs. And of these, the actions that they're taking are still somewhat conventional. So we have manure management, which is mostly in wealthy countries. We have feed improvement, only 16% of the countries. And we have 10% who are implementing silvopastoralism. So not enough action. Finally, again, place-based. How do we implement these things? We're not going to be implementing all of these actions globally, wall to wall. We have to prioritize. And so here you can see a map of hotspots. On the bottom, you can see the mitigation hotspots. And these largely represent where we also have livestock emissions hotspots. And on the top, you can see adaptation hotspots, where we have concentrations of climate hazards. And what's really notable from this is that we do not have a lot of overlap. right? You can see South Asia, there's a bit of overlap in red, but in sub-Saharan Africa, we have a high need for adaptation, and what we see for mitigation is areas in South America, Asia, and little spots elsewhere, and a lot of concentration in Europe. And so what I take from that is that as we pursue these livestock-related priorities, we're going to have to think not just about, we're going to have to think about how to achieve mitigation in those specific places. And if you're working on adaptation, you might well be working elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenny, for setting us off. And one of the things that's very striking from your presentation is the differences in livestock systems, and some require more focus on adaptation, some on mitigation. Strategies exist. Some of them seem much more effective. The adoption rate, the awareness of the strategies is low. So we're going to move on to our next presentation. That's really going to highlight a solution from a specific context. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. So each of them is going to give a presentation. First of all, we have Vincent Plamfort, who is an engineer in international agro development and a PhD in biology. He's a researcher in grassland and pasture agroecology at the French Agricultural Research Center for International Development, CIRAD. His research focuses on carbon fluxes and greenhouse gas balance of tropical grassland. So with that, Vincent, please.
Good afternoon. You hear me okay? Okay. I will present a very concrete situation in Amazonia. This presentation has been realized with my colleague René Pocard, that's working also at CIRAD. He is based at Paragominas, Brazil, the state of Para, and you can see the farming landscape of Para, where we are conduct a project, Terramas project, financed by Agence Française de Développement, French Agency of Development. And this project aims to reconcile the fight against deforestation and the development of Amazonia. So I will speak of eco-efficiency of cattle breeding in the Amazon. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, that's me. Okay, so the usual vision of Amazonia is, there is no pointer, okay, is, you know this picture with big fire, and this is a picture from pioneer front of Amazonia, where cattle ranching causing big deforestation, degradation because of extractive management. And we need to shift in another situation, that use, it's a different grazing farming system that use natural renewable resources for beef production. And we are talking of ecosystem services in integrated forest, pasture, farms, and landscape. So, this project is at different level. At farm level, of course, the efficiency of grazing system depends on pasture management. And for example, reduce methane emission, increase soil carbon. You know that soil carbon sequestration in grasslands coming from absorption of CO2 through the roots. And it's a very big potential. Methane emission. If you have a good management, you have a good quality of forage and you reduce methane emission, and so you can increase animal productivity. So the project is promoting intensification strategy, and we try to achieve more farmers and expand restoration to degraded area, sorry. And we use a tool, for example, at farm level. It's climate change tool for agriculture. It's a tool that can assess carbon energy balance in farm. It is adapted by CIRAD since several years in tropical context. It was a European tool. And from an initial diagnosis of the situation in a farm, based on life cycle analysis method, users can build and test different scenarios to evaluate the action to be implemented to have a best efficient. And the studies concern actually near 100 farms in Brazil, also in French Guyana. And for example, we have a typology of farms. There is some farm with high energy production in gigajoule per hectare, and the green point. And this farm have also low emission of CO2 per hectare. So this farm are very high efficiency. And the point, the yellow point, on contrary, there is a low energy production and very high emission of CO2, because this farmer use a lot of input and with a very low productivity. At landscape and jurisdiction level, so the method is to build a new landscape model of farming system in the area with high agriculture suitability. We can have pasture, and in the area with low agriculture suitability, the forest is coming back with a restoration operation, and it's conduct to high ecosystem services like carbon storage in soil, in the pasture, for example, and in forest. For the aerial carbon is very high potential in these farms that associate the two forms of storage. And of course, there is also other ecosystem services like biodiversity, because you can see there are corridors that are building, and it also regulates water, for example. And we need also a finance level, of course, because this farm this is small orders that can conduct this sort of intensification, and they need money, of course, to support new practice, new efficient practice, and so there is a green finance. Sorry, I just arrived in Sharm el-Sheikh this night. I'm quite tired. So banks have to finance this sort of new methodology, new farming system, and this is actually at the moment Banco of Amazonia. My colleague Isabel can give you some details in the debate that support this sort of new modeling of farming, and there is a MRV tool system for environment bonus. We can talk of that later. So I finish with some take-home messages. Moderate intensification system are adapted for most of farm in Amazonia. High technology is not needed to valorize the abundant natural renewable resources. This is solar energy that can use in farm. Invest in pasture, so it's pertinent to restore soil and degraded forest, and produce ecosystem services, especially carbon storage, biodiversity. And we need a local jurisdiction to establish rules and framework to organize this landscape restoration. So cattle ranching in the Amazonian can achieve a high environment performance, and we need also monitoring MRV system to conduct this. This is my last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for showing us how with not low investments we can make cattle systems in the Amazon much more sustainable, even bringing in the green finance aspect. Our next speaker is Isabel Garcia Drigo, and she has a bachelor's degree in social communication and a PhD in environmental science from the University of Sao Paulo, and she's the climate manager at Imaflora. So, Isabel, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, my colleagues of CIHAD and CGIAR. I will present to you some results of our work in a Carbon on Track program at Imaflora, and the first results we have with our partner Minerva Foods. I will go very quickly in this slide just to explain to you that Imaflora is an NGO, but you have this climate area, and you work in two big strategies. One is knowledge and advocacy. So we work, has been 10 years, we are more than 10 years working to improve some public policies in Brazil, like our Brazilian NDC, and also providing numbers to the inventory of greenhouse gases, national inventory. But now we have this program that's Carbon on Track, which we cooperate with other partners and organizations, academic organizations, private organizations, companies, to provide, to develop new methodologies more adapted to the tropical context. And we do also estimate the carbon balance of agricultural restoration and social biodiversity initiatives. I will pass. So just to, where is this? Okay, and we have this platform. It's a new platform when we provide some public information that's it's possible to take this stock taken in the trade programs of each sector that are estimating and measuring their carbon footprint. It's in Portuguese, but you have the English version soon. So now we will talk a little bit more about this work with Minerva Foods. So we are working with Minerva since the beginning of the last year with this pilot project of Minerva. So Minerva is working with 25 farms in Brazil. There is more farms now in the Renova program with this size of land and this size of the head of cattle. And to provide to us the main results, we have found that these farms on this pilot project have emitted 44 less GHG gases compared to the old average for emissions in beef production. So it's a very good news, it's very good results. It shows that it is possible to farmers implement good practices and lower their emissions. Sorry, I forgot that I have to. This graphic shows these 25 farms, 2 in Amazon, and the other ones in Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Colombia. So you can see again that the results are very good, so the performance is really very good. And also, 3 farms are carbon negative. Not in Brazil yet, but it will come soon. Eduardo Bastos is there, so it's and also Gracie. So it's a very, very good work. So just to, oh, sorry. I don't know, there is no the graphic appearing here, but we'd like to highlight at least one farm in Amazon region. That is the Fazenda Corumbiara. It's a very good performance in terms of carbon also, and it's due to the fact that they have a productive system that combine best practices. For instance, they have the intensification of the production cycle. They have also the integration of crop and livestock. So they can achieve these good numbers. Emissions are 42 below of the other average because they use technologies that are feasible. That's right. It's important to stress that they are working a long time with this practice, and they have a good position in the context. But it's possible if they have support, technical assistance, and access to finance to implement this. So it's just one example. Sorry, I don't know why is the graphic is not appearing. So Renata Potenza, it was our specialist that provide all these numbers and evaluation. So we can talk more in the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Thank you for showing us that 44% of the reduction in emissions was 44% relative to the global averages, which is tremendous. And then also dialing down on that model farm. Our last speaker is Todd Crane, and he's a principal scientist in the Sustainable Livestock Systems program at the International Livestock Research Institute. He leads the interdisciplinary research centered around social dimensions of climate change adaptation and mitigation in livestock systems. The research ranges from analyzing burdens and benefits of adaptation and mitigation practices within households to science policy interactions in national and international climate planning. Todd?
Thank you. So we're shifting geographies here from South America to Africa, where an important difference is that livestock have been integral to the ecologies of Africa for millennia now. So we have a really different presence and nature of livestock keeping. And maps are not working today, but thankfully we have text. So if we look at the nationally determined contributions, the policy obligations that are signed by individual countries, if we look all across Africa, that's Africa there, we see that there are 5 countries with only mitigation measures in their NDCs. They have 14 with adaptation only, and then 16 with both. And so what we see is that there's a relatively heavy emphasis on adaptation in Africa. However, when we look at the investment landscape, both for research and development, we start to see that there's a fairly heavy bias in the livestock sectors to lead with mitigation in Africa. This is despite the fact that the mitigation or the GHG emissions coming from Africa are relatively low. The nutritional insecurity in Africa is substantial. And yet we see a lot of investment pointing toward mitigation, leading with mitigation. However, when we talk to our stakeholders across Africa, and this ranges from policymakers all the way to producers themselves, adaptation is a clear priority because of the environmental stretch, the nature of climate change impacts, especially at present with the extraordinary drought going on in East Africa, 5 failed seasons in a row. This is extraordinary impacts on dryland pastoralists. It's also substantial impacts even in the upland systems, the mixed crop livestock systems, the smallholder dairy production systems. All of them are suffering equally under the current conditions. And we propose that producers and policymakers tend to emphasize adaptation as a priority, as well they should. Given the environmental presence of livestock in Africa since millennia, they're integral nation with the human ecology. Given the nutritional insecurity issues there, adaptation is and should be a top priority there. So why do we have so much on investment that's emphasizing and leading with, and perhaps only with, climate change mitigation in African livestock sectors. We see that shifting back. We propose that a lot of the reticence of investing in climate change adaptation in African livestock systems originates not with the nature of the systems there themselves, but with the nature of donor preoccupations. Obviously, the livestock sector in Europe, in North America, and elsewhere, the super intensive livestock are heavily critiqued, and not without reason. But those critiques are then translating into the ways that investment and priorities are made in Africa in what we feel is a fairly inappropriate way. So what we propose is that we really need to start emphasizing climate change adaptation in livestock systems in Africa, and which is not to say that we forget about mitigation, but that mitigation gains should be registered through adaptation progress, because that is the more urgent priority. There's a lot of lip service given to integrating local knowledge in climate solutions. At ILRI, we're working with a very practical way of actually doing this, to practically integrate local knowledge. This is through a focus on climate adaptation innovators. Instead of looking at climate adaptation as a problem-oriented analysis, who are the people that are succeeding? Who are the people that are innovating in ways, dealing with the climate stressors in ways that succeed where others struggle? And how can we use those as seeds of change in moving forward with climate change adaptation? Because, of course, technical analysis of adaptation and climate stressors tends to lead to narrow technical solutions. But we know that adaptation, to be integrated into farmers' livelihoods and day-to-day practices, it needs to attend to a lot of different drivers, not just climate. It needs to be profitable. It needs to be attendant to labor demands and finance capacities. It needs to be gender equitable, because we see a lot of adaptation and mitigation practices tend to add extra labor burdens to women's unpaid labor in households, shifting the benefits of adaptation actually away from women. So we're looking for adaptations that are already embedded within livelihoods, because these have a capacity to be adopted and spread more easily, instead of a kind of a top-down linear adaptation or technology change approach, which we tend to see don't always succeed. And then this is not saying researchers don't have a role anymore, because research does have a role in this. Once we identify specific innovations, climate innovations, researcher has the capacity to backstop these, to improve, tweak them, to really help build the adaptive capacity of African smallholder livestock keepers in a very practical and immediate sense. It's very disappointing about the photos today. So we're adapting a positive deviance approach from public health that is looking at where people succeed, where most others fail, and doing participatory adaptation analysis. So listening to the innovators, who are the people that are doing these things, what are they doing, what enables them to do that, where did these ideas come from? How can we build capacities to actually gather data, farmers' capacities to engage in the research, to gather data, to understand how and why certain practices work. And then starting with these adaptation innovators, do farmer-to-farmer field days as a mode of extension. So again, extension is not a top-down imposition. It's not an adoption dissemination pathway. It's people learning from each other about what works, because farmers often listen to each other more effectively than they do listen to scientists. And then exchanging knowledge through that. We are doing analyses on, we've done this in several different sites, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Kenya, with a different practice in each space. The analyses of these, the publication of these are forthcoming, but we see in each of these spaces that farmers are pioneering different practices that are working for them, and starting to unpack how they are working, why they are working, and how those practices can reach other people so that the benefit can be more widespread. We have intensive sheep fattening in the highland Ethiopia, changing herd composition in the Ethiopian lowlands, more away from cattle toward sheep, goats, and camels. Water harvesting and management is tremendously important in southwest Uganda. Feeds in the Kenyan highland, mixed crop dairy systems. And in Kenyan lowlands, again, we have Maasai pastoralists who are starting to play around with different breed mixes, hybrids, and production strategies to deal with the climatic and livelihood stressors are undergoing there. So pursuing this, we recommend that climate change adaptation should start from producers' perspectives, because they are the ones living the lives, living the production livelihoods that need to be adapted, and embed that adaptation within wider systemic transformations and rural livelihoods. Again, always holding in mind that adaptation isn't just about climate. It's about livelihood, it's about environment, it's about governance, it's about lifestyle expectations, it's about all of those things. Climate change adaptation should work with producers as research partners who have important roles in data collection, interpretation, and dissemination for scaling, for reaching other producers with that information on these practices so it can be made immediately useful for them. And in conclusion, we hold that climate investment in African livestock systems should focus on adaptation and food security. Mitigation is still important, and even when we talk to African livestock keepers, smallholder livestock keepers, they recognize climate change is a thing and we don't want to cause it, so they're interested, but that's not the primary concern in any given moment. Mitigation is a co-benefit of adaptation, and that producer-led climate change adaptation has a strong capacity to contribute to climate change adaptation through local innovation and scaling efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. Very interesting presentation. I really liked how you emphasized that although the donor agenda has supported a lot of work on mitigation, the greater need is adaptation and promoting food security, and then working hand in hand with the producers, with the farmers, to ensure that they're involved. We take their thoughts into account. Gender issues are front and center, and this is the way to go. So we've had some excellent talks here, right from Lini, who started with the framing and shared with us the different approaches and the lack of widespread uptake, to the two presentations showing significant reductions, major reductions in emissions in the Americas, and then finally with Todd's looking at emphasizing the need for adaptation and working hand in hand with the farmers to develop the solutions. So now we have our panel, and we'll be opening this up for questions. So I'm going to start by asking Vincent a question, and then if you have a question, please put up your hand and we'll call you to ask your question, and please wait for the microphone. So Vincent, you talked about ecosystem services. In the Amazonia area that you referred to, are the farmers being paid for those ecosystem services?
Yeah. First, I have to say that, of course, in the context of Amazonia, the fight against deforestation remains a priority, of course. But complementary, you have to manage the area that have been still deforested. So you need, like I explained, you need some new management to intensification of this farming system, and what the project proposed, and Isabella also talk of that, is that this farming system had to integrate forest and pasture. So this is a question of land sharing or land sparing. And if you consider forest inside the farming system, you can have a production, if possible, efficiency with some method of intensification, and you have also the forest that can provide ecosystem services. So it's a new point of view, and for example, the forest can storage a lot of aerial carbon, some 200 tons of carbon per hectare, for example, and pasture too. In the soil, you can have 100 tons of carbon per hectare. So it's a combination of in between agriculture area and natural area, and so it's a new point of view. And if you have tools like I explained, some tools to evaluate the carbon balance, for example, with MRV system, you can be supported by financial that can be in interest. So I think this system can provide ecosystem services and produce efficiency beef.
You can hold it. Thank you very much, Vincent. I don't see any hands up yet. So, okay, the gentleman in the gray suit, please.
Thank you, panel, and Chair. It's a perfect entree, actually, because it's the second half of your question. I'm Ross Hampton. I look after forestry in Australia, but I'm the chair of the FAO's Advisory Committee on Sustainable Forest-Based Industries. So we are always trying to look for the ways to engage the private sector in some of these global problems. And we're always looking for opportunities to help farmers and smallholders become carbon neutral by adding forestry, and particularly production forestry, that's the other half of the coin, to the mix. So tomorrow night at 6:30 in the Kufa room, the World Farming Organization will have a farmer on the stage from Australia who has become carbon neutral by doing half biodiversity, ecosystem services plantings, half production plantings, and he's grown his 25,000 strong sheep herd to be even more productive. So he's getting a win-win-win. So the question, I think I'd start with you, Lindy, is you mentioned I think 10% only are working towards that trees on farms approach for mitigation. What do we need to do with the private sector to increase the numbers?
So the first step would be the R&D, and specifically R&D on things like food additives. So I'm talking about wealthier, middle and higher income countries right now, but extending food additives to grazing situations and expanding the range of food additives that are available. The food additive that I forgot before, a feed additive that I forgot before was seaweed or asparagopsis. So nitrates, asparagopsis, and 3-NOP. Sorry, I can't hear you, and I apologize for the acoustics in this room. The other place where the private sector can help is in just improved feed, right? And that's where we have opportunities in places that are lower income. Thank you.
We have one question from the gentleman in the...
Thank you very much. My name is Bernard Moro. I'm from Kenya. I work closely with the elderly team. It's a question actually which is cutting across because I work in the policy arena. We are doing a lot of work in terms of bringing in technologies and evidence to show that we are actually going net zero in some areas. How are we linking this to policy? Yeah, so that we are talking about technologies that and evidence that can actually inform policy for a longer term implementation of, or even scaling out of some of these practices. And it cuts across, I mean, from the presentations.
Okay, so who would like to take that question about impacting policy? Yes, Isabel, thank you.
Okay, so it's a very good question. So, for instance, in Brazil, we have a governmental plan that's ABC plan, and now we have a ABC plus. That's a list of all the technologies and best practice that can be used by farmers, by producers. But besides this plan, we have the financial program that provides money, that provides financial resources to implement this practice. So this is the main public policy in Brazil. So we have to not only the list of to-dos or the best practices, but the conditions, so enabling conditions to farmers. That's it, technical assistance and finance. We have all this in Brazil. We can improve a lot the implementation of this public policy, improve the public policies themselves, but we need this policy will to do that. And also, I think that the private-public partnerships are also very important. So you use the part of the incentives of the public policy, but with the help of a private power to spread, for instance, because in Brazil, like in Africa, we have huge territories, and you have different profile of farmers. So small farmers, medium farmers, big farmers that are well positioned. So you need this partnership also between public and private efforts.
While we're waiting for the next question, I'm going to ask Todd. We've had some major flooding in Nigeria, just like Pakistan. We've had droughts in Kenya, like you mentioned. What specific adaptation measures are you promoting to address these types of issues?
Well, as outlined in my presentation, my specific group, we are not promoting anything. We are reversing the tables a bit and saying, well, because so much, I think, effort is misspent in trying to find the thing to promote and then discovering that we're not promoting it well or not promoting the right thing, but what's already working. Now, this is not to dismiss research, because we need that, because heat stress is an increasing issue. The flooding issue this is a landscape level management question that's has a lot to do with mobility and being able to move, do large scale landscape planning to move. But I think we really need to look at complements to the promoting practices to integrate what's already practical, what's already working, and let people promote what's already working to each other.
Looking at what those innovators, you call them, are already doing that is climate smart, and then promoting that. Thank you. More questions? Yes, please.
Hi, so I'm here studying the role of small-scale agriculture workers in this process as a whole, or I should say farmers, and specifically women. So I guess this question is more directed towards you, Todd, because you mentioned gender equity briefly. But I'm just curious, specifically in Africa, where the small-scale farmers make up such a large portion of the economy, and a large portion of that is women, how are you ensuring that their voices are heard at every level of this process, including here at COP, because it does go beyond just farmers talking to each other as an afterthought. So I'm just curious, to hear what you have to say.
My team does a lot of gender research and youth research as well, I should add. So understanding the social differentiation dynamics that come with the climate change adaptation and mitigation very broadly. We're starting to look, and the kind of adaptation innovators work did not focus on gender in the piloting phase, but we're starting that now to address those concerns. We're starting to work a lot more thinking about, bundling technical innovations with social interventions. So yes, there's this new practice, it's more efficient, it's better for adaptation and or mitigation. But we know, because of what we understand of social organization, that this is likely to become extra women's labor burden. How can we do what I'm going to very broadly call social intervention? So yes, there's a technology bit. Hey, let's sit with people, men and women, and talk about distribution of benefit and labor in a household and how that might be done differently. And I think there's a lot of potential in actually focusing on gender research, which is relational between men and women, and not just focusing on women. There's a lot of research on women training, women capacity building, women, all that. But if you don't involve the men, who are, to be very blunt, part of the problem, then you're not going to get very far with that. So really starting to think about what's increasingly called socio-technical bundles. So you get the technology, but understand the social aspect of its implementation and address some of the potential inequalities. And I think we also...
For the moment, it's not a model, it's diagnostic tools, but we try to implement with some biological model, for example, carbon, nitrogen cycle, and it's for the future. For the moment, it's very practical model. It's just Excel tools, not complex, and you can use it to identify some sector of the farm that could be more efficient. So, and after we have some researches, some experimental researches that shows that how to improve soil with organic matter, how to manage pasture, to favorize carbon and nitrogen cycle. But it's not in the model for the moment. It's separate. So we put a diagnosis, and with our results, we try to give some new practices for the farmer. And okay, for the future we try to combine it and to have a tools combining diagnosis and modeling.
Thank you very much. It's great to hear that that's in the pipeline. It's always vital that as we continue to focus on climate change and emissions, we also think about the whole cycle and the whole ecosystem. We think about nutrient flows. We think about gender, that was mentioned earlier. More questions, please. We have time for a few more questions. Anybody? Yes, please. Please introduce yourself. Just your name and affiliation, and then your question.
Thank you very much. I am Tahira Mohammed. I am from Northern Kenya, a PhD student at the Institute of Development Studies in Brighton. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. I'm actually so excited because from all the events that I attended, this is the one which talks about livestock, because every other thing is generalizing farming, agriculture, and livestock is given little mention. So my question is cut across all the panelists, and also it's a kind of comment, not question, about knowledge and advocacy, especially about sharing knowledge and innovation from the local perspective. That has been mentioned in several events in this COP, but I have not come across what that innovation is from the local perspective. Are we still trying to advocate for what we're not doing in actual sense? So how can we fasten this aspect of innovation from the local perspective? Because we've been mentioning that in all the events, but I haven't seen any actions in terms of that perspective. Thank you.
Who would like to take that? Innovation from the local perspective. Isabel, you want to tell us, please?
Yeah, I can try. In fact, I think that we talk a lot about innovation, and when we apply innovation in the agriculture sector or livestock production, in some contexts, we have to recognize that we have already technologies in place. We have already ways to produce that can be good for the environment. So I have to confess that I am skeptical about all have to be innovation. So yes, when we can, or when this makes sense. For instance, these new additives, who you be able to buy if you are talking about smallholders or even medium producers in Brazil? So you have to value the practice and what is feasible and progress in that terms. But I am not so how do I say that, so credible about this innovation discourse or innovation narrative only. Sorry, it's my view.
Does anybody else want to add to that? I think Isabella's comments are well made. Go ahead, Vincent.
Yeah, I agree with that. And of course, there is not only innovation. If you, for having a vision of local priority, you can have also contextualized method to assess the system. And IPCC method is very good, but they are very global. And we need a very contextualized method to assess the system, because you can say, Todd, you say something, and for example, livestock in Africa is always criticized because it's very, there is a very bad efficiency. And we have other side, even when we show no, African livestock can be very efficient. Amazonian livestock can be very efficient. So because we use contextualized method and not global method, and so we care of your local question.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to draw the panel to a close because it's already 2 o'clock, surprisingly. But I want to thank each of our panelists for very illuminating presentations. And I hope you go away with a strong sense about the variability, the different types of livestock systems, and how critical it is to tailor the mitigation and adaptation options to the local context. Solutions exist, some of them in the hands of the farmers, like Todd said, that we need to work with. And then as we think about new technologies, we have to work with the farmers to look at how relevant they are and how feasible it is to adopt them. Thank you so much for your time.